and unknowns, and that's the mitzvah of kosher. So DIY kosher, do-it-yourself kosher. What is kosher? How is kosher? Why is kosher? And how can we each do kosher on our own in our own homes? Well, the joke is told that the rabbi is walking down the street in the neighborhood to the synagogue, or perhaps from the synagogue, and the rabbi notices a congregant, a member of the community, let's call him Isaac, and he's going into a non-kosher restaurant. And the rabbi is watching in horror, and he tells himself, probably he just wanted to get, just needed to get change or use the restroom, and he's not actually going to have a meal in the non-kosher restaurant. Well, sure enough, the rabbi sees through the window how Isaac sits down, gets himself a nice table, and is ready to order. As well, maybe he just is chatting with someone, he's not really going to order anything. But he calls over the waiter, and he orders a meal. And the rabbi is watching in shock, and he says, maybe he's just going to order a drink or something that's kosher. But no, he orders a full meal that couldn't have possibly been kosher. And the rabbi just couldn't believe his eyes, standing outside there, horrified. When Isaac is finally done and he comes out, the rabbi says, "What's going on? I saw you going to the restaurant, sit down, order, and eat this non-kosher meal, and get up and go. What kind of business is this?" So Isaac says, "You mean you were watching the whole time?" He says, "Yeah, I saw everything." Thank God, it was all under rabbinical supervision. So of course that's just a joke, because rabbinical supervision, or as some people say, a blessing by the rabbi, doesn't make it kosher. What makes it kosher is that we follow the actual laws that the Torah gives that define what kosher is. So there's a lot of misconceptions about what that actually means, and how important kosher is, and how accessible and doable kosher might be. So we're going to try to clear them up. And as usual, there's much more information than we can possibly cover in one short class, but we'll try to do it in a nutshell. So kosher is a set of laws that are spelled out in the Torah and in rabbinic writings, just like any Jewish law, just like any part of the halacha that governs Jewish life, that the Torah gives us the basics, and we have further information as we've talked in the past. And these are a set of laws about what should be eaten and what should not be eaten. Now, the word kosher, the term kosher, which we just take to mean these dietary rules, is actually a very helpful term, because it helps us understand what it's all about. Kosher actually means fit or appropriate, but fit and being the right thing for the right place at the right time. Does not mean, the term kosher does not refer to cleanliness or the level of hygiene or health or anything of that sort. The word actually means fit. So when people say that kosher is about health or hygiene and things that people weren't that knowledgeable or that good at a couple thousand years ago, but today we've gotten ahead and we can figure out the health and the hygiene with or without kosher. Well, when people say that, they might mean well, but they're making a mistake, because kosher doesn't actually have anything to do with those things. Kosher means fit, means appropriate. It's what God tells us is fit and appropriate for us. Why are these things fit and appropriate? Why are these things the kosher and the right things to be eaten? First of all, because that's the divine command, because that's the mitzvah. Simply because the Torah said so, because God said so, that's what makes it be the best choice. But going a step further, being fit, being befitting, would mean that this is eligible, or this has the right potential. Now, what does that mean? So we engage actually in our physical world. You may have noticed by now that in other religions and other groups, there may be a monk of sorts or some kind of spiritual figure whose goal is to be transcendent, to rise and to meditate and not be a part of the regular mundane life. These are people who typically do not marry and do not engage in the world as we know it. While in Judaism, it's the other way around. Because our goal in Judaism is not to disappear from or disengage from the physical life, but to elevate it and upgrade, and as we keep talking about, enhance and improve our world. So everything we do as we engage in the material world that we live in is all about an opportunity to elevate it, to make it better than it was, to make it more godly than it was, all the way to the time of Moshiach when we'll reach the peak. Well, actually, it turns out that there are some things that have the potential to be elevated, to become godly, and other things that don't have that potential in the same way. So, for example, you can make a delicious and very attractive looking pastry or cake, but you can only do that with the right ingredients. Not everything can be made into a wonderful cake. And you can paint the most beautiful painting, but only with colors and inks and whatever you would use to paint. You can't paint it with other types of materials. You need to have the right ingredients to be able to make this beautiful and wonderful result. So when we try to elevate our world and make it more divine, there are certain things that fit in certain places and certain things that have a potential to become divine as we engage with them, and other things that are better left alone. And this is what the Torah tells us when it comes to kosher. Only certain foods, when we eat them, when we make them part of our lives, when we use them to provide nutrition and to energize ourselves, only those things have the potential to grow with us and become better and elevated through the fact that we use them for some good purpose. But other things that don't have that potential, those are the things known as not kosher, which we shouldn't be eating, we shouldn't be engaging with, because they will actually, instead of us helping them, they will actually be detrimental to us. So when the Torah says that this food is kosher and this food is not, this food is fit, this food is appropriate, this food has the potential to grow, to become part of the goodness we want to bring into this world, while the other we should leave aside. But on the other hand, because God and the Torah are calling this particular food kosher, meaning fit, well, that means it's fit all around, not just fit in a spiritual sense, that it's spiritually appropriate for us and spiritually can be elevated, but also fit in a practical human sense. And that's why kosher food is in fact healthier. And this is not just common discussion and something popular to say, but it's found in Jewish texts all the way back to Maimonides, we talked about last week, explaining why some of these practices, such as removing the blood as we do, or certain animals that we don't eat, why these things are better for actual physical health. And that's because when God says this is the right food for you, it couldn't be that it's only the right food spiritually, but physically it will harm us. If God is recommending it, it's also good for us on a very basic human level. Now, on a deeper level, the purpose and achievement of kosher is actually indicated in the Torah itself. But let's have a look at this reading from Nachmanides. This will give us the idea. So Nachmanides Ramban is a contemporary, right after, I should say, the Rambam, and he just explains the ideas behind kosher in his commentary to the Torah. And here he says, the prohibition of certain foods is for the purity of the soul, namely that one should eat clean things that will not generate coarseness of the soul. Thus the verse states, and you shall be holy people to me. That is to say, I desire you should be people of holiness, so that you should be fitting for me to cleave to me, for I am holy. Accordingly, you shall not contaminate your souls by eating abominable things. So, as the verse which was quoted here says, and you shall be holy people to me. That means by doing these kosher rules, we become holy to God. We become associated with God. When we don't eat those things that we say generate coarseness and negativity, this actually makes us holier. In other words, imagine nobility or an aristocrat. There's a certain code of conduct. There's a certain appropriate behavior. They don't just do anything or anywhere, anytime. There are certain norms that are appropriate for that kind of personality. Well, God tells us to be his people, to be holy to me, to be the Jewish people, to be special. And God tells us how to do so. And a big part of that is what we eat and how we eat it that makes us be those holier people. Specifically speaking, when it comes to kosher, these foods, certain foods, have negativity to them, sometimes in ways we understand, such as birds of prey or even animals of prey that are violent, we don't eat because we don't want to associate with that violence. In other foods, it's in ways that we don't understand, but these are foods and these are animals and these are items that have negativity to them, which we don't want to include it to ourselves because we are supposed to be godly, we are supposed to be holy, we are supposed to be special, and we're supposed to live and conduct and eat that which makes us be special and not the opposite. This is actually why right now at this time of the year, which is the time of the year when as we've been discussing, we mourn the loss of the temple in Jerusalem, and we try to learn about that temple and connect to it. This is why this is an important topic for tonight, for this season, because actually, as we talked last week, the temple in Jerusalem had the sacrifices, the offerings which were offered to God, which was really a means of bringing ourselves closer to God. Now that we don't have the temple, one of the replacements for that altar, for that Mizbeach, we would offer the offerings, we know from our sages, is the table. As we eat on our tables, we are also offering a kind of offering to God in the sense that this is also part of our getting closer to God by doing it right, by doing it in the spiritual, good, and godly way with the laws of kosher. Now, when we talk about kosher being a means for us to be elevated, for us to be holier, for us to be more connected, for us to be more godly, well, in that case, let's watch this clip, which is a little illuminating story, shall we say, that I really come to love, and maybe I've shown it before, but it bears repeating. It's relevant to mitzvahs in general, and especially to kosher.
So the three of us went to see the Rebbe, myself, my ex-wife, and her father, my father-in-law, and Mr. Ratner, Maurice Ratner. Before when we were waiting there, they came up to me and said, they told me I should write out a note for the Rebbe, some request. And I told them I have no requests and I have nothing I want from the Rebbe. I was just here to facilitate my wife and helping her in, and other than that, I was just a bystander. I'd be sitting in the back, so there was no need for me to write anything. They were very, very insistent that I couldn't go in unless I wrote something. So, with that ultimatum, I just said, if God's so great, why does he insist on all these tiny details? Why can't I let him skip? And that's all. That's the only question I had. And just because he told me I had to write something, and it always did bother me that if God was so great, why was he stuck with all these tiny details? And it seemed to upset him if we missed one. If you used a meat spoon and cottage cheese, you have to go bury it and pull your hair on there. So I could never get that. It really was beyond me. So that's basically what I was asking the Rebbe, what all the angst was about. So he began by asking each one of us our names, and I told him my name was Avram David. Then he asked our mother's name too, Ben Malka, and my ex said Yochevet Chana Baspina, and my father said Moshe Ben Chana. And the Rebbe just stopped and began tapping with his pencil. We all just looked, and then the Rebbe addressed my father and says, "Your son-in-law has two names, and your daughter has two names." My father thought, and he said, "Oh, my mother's name is Hannah Hendel." The Rebbe just nodded and wrote that down too. And then he turned to me and he said, "I don't understand your question." So I thought it was pretty forthright. So I started to say it in Yiddish, thinking maybe he had difficulty with English. And he stopped me, put his hand up, and he said, "It's not for God, it's for us." And I could see, I'm convinced this, God wants us close to him, and this is the path he gives us. It's like he gave a path, and he said, "If you follow this path, you'll find me." And it's not that if you don't follow this path, I'm going to blind you, I'll hurt you. Just the opposite. I want you to come close. And here I'm giving you a path, a means in which you can find this proximity, this closeness with me. It was a very radical thought to me. I had never ever seen Judaism in that light. It was always focused on what was forbidden and the consequences of doing what's forbidden. It was in yeshiva, I was away, everything was taught with the slap, with the hit, and you're no good, and Ozvorf. So I had more than my fill of Judaism, and but this really intrigued me. I was very taken. I felt as though I was in a dark room and someone had opened up a light. Then I went.
So as the Rebbe explained to this individual, it's not about what we could do, what we can't do, and being afraid of a misstep. It's about opportunities to connect to God by doing the mitzvah, and particularly when it comes to kosher and all of its little details, these are our opportunities, our chance to be more holy, to be more divine. So let's keep that in mind as we start to talk about all those specifics. So there are numerous laws and numerous details to the laws of kosher. But briefly, do we get a general picture? There are kosher animals and non-kosher animals. So step one in kosher would really be that the meat and any meat product should come from a kosher animal, such as beef, and not a non-kosher animal, such as, famously, the pig would be a non-kosher animal. Now, the same actually applies to birds and fowl and any type of fish. There are kosher and non-kosher birds, and there are kosher and non-kosher fish. And so the starting point is to identify, is the species kosher? But that's not the end of the story. We might have beef, or we might have chicken, and they're kosher. But the animal is only potentially kosher. That meat will only be kosher if it is properly slaughtered as per the way the Torah prescribes, which is actually the most humane way possible, but the system has to be strictly followed, how we slaughter, and that's what makes the meat actually kosher for consumption. Not only that, but there are certain parts of the animal, certain fats that are unkosher, we do not eat them, and we do not consume any blood at all. So you might think of, it's kind of unpleasant for some, but you might think of meat being prepared and the animal being slaughtered and the blood being rinsed off and prepared for packaging. But actually, in a kosher slaughterhouse, the meat would have to be salted to drain out the blood from inside so that no blood remains at all, not only the blood that's visible, which would just be washed off, but it's actually drained internally of any blood. Otherwise, it would not be kosher. So kosher meat is the right species, the right slaughtering process, the right parts of the animal, and removal of the blood. Now we have to remember that kosher meat is great, but it stops being kosher when we mix it with milk. This might be one of the most famous kosher laws, that meat and dairy cannot mix. Meat and dairy are kept completely separate. So no cheeseburgers. If it's real cheese and real burgers and not soy, no cheeseburgers because no meat and milk. The other thing to remember is that byproducts of a non-kosher animal are also not kosher. So the eggs of a non-kosher bird, the milk of a non-kosher animal, those are things that are not kosher as well. And that would apply also to all the derivatives, such as things that are produced today, such gelatins, certain other chemicals and flavors that are made from animal products. They would not be kosher if they don't come from a properly prepared kosher animal. So that's in terms of meats. Fish do not need to be slaughtered, but has to be an actual kosher fish prepared under supervision. Then we get to maybe healthier stuff. Grains, fruits, vegetables, beans, and all kinds of plants. Technically, these are all kosher. There aren't any plants that are not kosher. That they grow from the ground, they grow from the tree, they are all kosher, and they can all be consumed. However, there are two things to keep in mind. The smaller, less common issue is the agriculture laws. So these are laws that, for the most part, apply only in Israel. And that's the rules, we talked about it a little bit when we talked about charity, the rules of tithing and other gifts, other things that were supposed to be removed from the produce and given to charity or to the temple or whatever it is. Until that is done, the produce may not be eaten. So if you go into a store, you buy the produce, it's automatically kosher unless it comes from Israel, which then we have to make sure that the process was followed. But that's already in our area less common. What is a common problem is infestation. So all insects of any kind and size are not kosher. Now, typically people don't eat those things, kind of unpleasant. But what we're less aware of is that many vegetables, some fruits, some grains, especially some leafy stuff, are infested with minute creatures that we don't usually see, but they're there, and the research can tell you that they're there, and proper preparation can remove them. But that needs to be done for that vegetable or that plant to be considered kosher. So technically any vegetable will be kosher so long as we make sure that it's not infested in any way, or we remove or wash out whatever might be there. And there's, depending on the type of produce, there are different ways to do that. Now, as an exception of sorts to the natural produce being kosher rule would be wine and grape juice. So wine or grape juice is technically just squeezed grapes, should be kosher, but actually it needs to be prepared under supervision in order for it to actually be kosher. That's a unique law that applies to wine and therefore would extend to any type of dish that involves wine. Now, once we've figured out the kosher meats, the kosher fish, the kosher dairy that's coming from a kosher animal and is supervised, as we'll discuss, we have the right produce with no infestation, no wine, all of that is worked out. We still have another issue, and that is the utensils, the dishes. Dishes that are used for non-kosher cooking, for non-kosher cutting, for non-kosher food preparation, will typically become non-kosher by absorbing the flavor. So if you ask any good distillery fellow from Scotland how to make scotch, they tell you that the barrel matters a lot. If you use a bourbon barrel or a sherry cask, you change your scotch. The flavor that is absorbed in the barrel from its previous contents is shared with the next contents. So we cook in a pot, that heat brings flavor into the pores of the metal or whatever the pot is made out of, and that flavor will be shared with the next thing cooked in the pot. So as the Torah itself specifies, we read it in last week's portion, these utensils which are used for non-kosher would need to be purged by a special process to remove any of that residue and remove that flavor from inside the walls. So technically the pot looks sparkling clean, but there's non-kosher flavor inside of it. We have to get that flavor out in order that it isn't shared with our kosher dish. Now, there are also a couple of rabbinic rules that were added as safeguards in kosher, and that is that cooking or baking should always have a Jewish involvement, and that milk should be supervised so that we know it's coming only from the cow or goat and not from a non-kosher animal. Now, hearing all this, a person might think that, okay, so I can go to a vegetarian restaurant and order a salad and I'll be all right, it'll be kosher. It's a little more complicated than that because A, as we already mentioned, the dishes need to be kosher as well. And B, what's important always to remember, particularly in modern times, is the industrial process of food production. So as much as we might want to think of our food as natural and organic and etc., most of the products that are available are produced in industrial settings via some very sophisticated processes. And that's where supervision by a kosher supervising agency becomes so critical. Because a product that can seem totally benign, and this would just be an easily kosher product, just some very basic vegetable or fruit or other plant-based product, can actually turn out to be non-kosher. That might be an additive that's used in there as a preservative or as a flavor or as something else that you're not even aware is not kosher because it's a chemical compound, you don't really know where it comes from. Or you don't even know that additive is being used because some of them are not legally required to be listed. That's where we require supervision to research the product and make sure it's actually kosher. But then there's also the process, how these foods are prepared in an industrial setting. So I actually always love the example of canned corn. So pretty much in any supermarket you can get, and they're typically pretty cheap, a can, vacuum packed, a can of corn filled, ready to go. It would seem to be a very kosher product. All you have there is corn and salt and maybe water. What could be non-kosher about that? Well, it actually would be kosher ingredients, but there's a little problem. The problem is that when those cans are sealed, they are also steamed in the factory. That steam costs money to generate, costs gas or whatever other system they're using to heat the steam, which is why these plants, these factories share the steam. They use the same steam in a process they call retro from one product to the next. So after the steam has been used to seal one type of can, it's then being used to seal and finish the process for another type of can. So what happens when the first can is lard, which is obviously not kosher, and the same steam, which similar to a pot has absorbed the flavor, is now being used to seal your cans of corn. That's why even in something that simple, kosher supervision is required. Now, practically speaking, kosher supervision is readily available, and you can see that in symbols that look like these or similar to them. A little blurry in this vision here. This is the OU. It's probably the largest or one of the largest supervising agencies. The OK, the CRC, Chicago Rabbinical Council, the Kaf K for Kosher K, and the Star K out of Baltimore. These are some of the larger national agencies that supervise products from A to Z and actually create contracts with the manufacturers to ensure the kosher product is being followed all the way through. And you can find these markings on the packaging of many, many common foods. So you might think that keeping kosher or adding more kosher to your diet is way out of reach. But if you go into any supermarket of a major chain in a major American city, including right around here, you'll have tens of thousands of kosher products, and not just in the little kosher aisle, but throughout the store. Products of all types that carry these symbols because they have been supervised as kosher. So that is a very good and easy way to make a start towards actually doing this great mitzvah of kosher, and that is by looking out for those symbols and buying products that carry them as opposed to the similar product that does not. Now you might ask, how do I know what's a kosher symbol? Because the truth is there are over 1,000 certifying agencies throughout the world. You might ask, how do I know which kosher symbol is reliable? Because as you may guess, some of them are not very proficient or otherwise negligent. You got to know which brand or which stamp to trust. Well, thank God there's an app for that. And not just for that, but for kosher in general. So if you look here, this is the Apple version. This is pretty much how it will look. This is the CRC, Chicago Rabbinical Council's app. Excellent. It will list all kinds of products and the rules that apply, as well as a detailed list of kosher supervising agencies and their symbols. That's the Android version right here. So you see the various screens, what they offer, what they clarify. You can look up products to know if they even need to be certified. Some very, very basic things do not need to be. You can look up certifying symbols to know whether they're reliable, and many, many other questions that may come your way as you try to incorporate more kosher. So as usual, I'm going to share the links for these apps into the chat and into the comments online once we're done, because these could be very helpful to all of us as we try to keep more kosher. And when I say we try to keep more kosher, there's something to remember here and something to think about, and that is that it's not all or nothing. It may be very difficult for some of us to make that leap, but it's not all or nothing. Every non-kosher product that we remove from our diets and replace with a kosher product, each and every time, that's a mitzvah. And every time we do that mitzvah, that creates a connection, as we watched, a bond between us and God that elevates us, that has all these great accomplishments that kosher has. So just because your dishes have not yet been made kosher, or you've got other things in your life that are not yet kosher, it doesn't mean that when you go to the supermarket, you don't have the option to choose kosher products over non-kosher products. You certainly do. And the more you do that, the more mitzvah you're fulfilling each and every time. So I would suggest choosing something. Often I would recommend to start with kosher meat, which is one of the more serious prohibitions within kosher, avoiding non-kosher meat. And as you make the purchase kosher meat. You can get them around here in a very wide selection at the Jewel in Highland Park and in some other places. That would be a great initial start, but it can really be anything. Try to cut out a non-kosher item and replace it with a kosher item. Now, another resource, as opposed to that app, is this little book. It probably comes up backwards on your screen. Going Kosher in 30 Days. Going Kosher in 30 Days is like a little how-to guide with this bagel on the front to kind of seem like Jewish food. And it really goes a day-by-day process of learning what kosher really means, the details, and taking small steps to help yourself be more kosher. This is a book that we can order. This is a book that actually I have a number of copies of, if anybody wants one. And this is something to kind of hold on to. It's almost pocket-sized, and it can guide you through steps that you may be considering to take to increase your kosher observance. On Thursday, we will have a special presentation, this time on the temple in Jerusalem. So, of course, Jerusalem and the Temple Mount was the center of Jewish life in ancient Israel. That's where our connection to God was most manifest. That's where our celebration of life and of Judaism took place. That was really the center of the Jewish people in every way, at our holiest place. Well, what did that place really look like? We have some information on that from the texts, as well as fascinatingly from archaeology. And we're going to talk about the temple and discover what it means, what it's about, and how it actually looked. So please join us on Thursday, same place, same time, which would be 8 o'clock. In the meantime, I'm going to end the live feed and take any questions